Hi everyone, my name is Renata and welcome to another video with me. This time, instead of making an inspirational video, I thought to make a video in which I will show some useful tips and tricks, but also techniques for coloring your projects in art journaling, card making, or in general mixed media. At the start you could have seen the stamp set that I used, the type of paper, but also the ink which I used for stamping my images. And the first coloring technique that I am going to share with you today is coloring with colored pencils. This time I decided to use Prismacolor Premier color pencils as they are my favorite. They are wax-based pencils and in my opinion they are easy to blend. But of course we all have our preferences. No matter which medium you choose to work with, it is really important to make a difference between darker and lighter shades. Otherwise your colored images might look just a little bit flat. But before I continue with any other advices, I would just like to state that I am not a coloring professional. I haven't gone to any art schools. This is just something that I have learned throughout the years, through my own personal experience, but also through watching videos on YouTube from some other artists. Sometimes when I color my images, I do try to think about from where is the light source coming, where would the shadows be naturally, but most of the times I just do it as I feel it in the moment. As you could have seen, I started with the darkest shade towards the center of my flower, and then working toward the edges of my petals I was going with brighter shades of blue. Now, when working with Prismacolor pencils, there is 3 ways to blend in your color. You can go with the brightest color all over your petal, like I am doing here. That way your image becomes a bit more waxy to the touch and it makes it harder to layer the colors. By the similar principle works the blending pencil. It also leaves this waxy layer and saturates the color, making it harder to layer. So my favorite to-go technique is using odorless mineral spirit. For this technique I tend to use a blending stump. And then I go normally from brighter to darker area of the colored image and blend in the colors. The reason why I like this technique the best is because it doesn't leave that waxy finish and it makes me able to layer the colors more if necessary. Instead of the paper stump you can use a brush, but I do advise it to keep the brush clean, or if working with a paper stump, to have 1 stump for each color, so you don't contaminate the colors that you already have. Now off camera I repeated the same process for the rest of my flower, and one thing with the pencils that you will notice is that it dulls the stamped lines. And it is not necessary, but I do like to go with the black pencil all over those lines to make the image more bold. If you want to make some highlights, you can use the pencil, acrylic pen like I did here, or gel pen. Really up to your choice. The second most common technique that I use to color my images is using watercolors. This particular palette is from Studio Light and Art by Marlene. So what I do is prepare a glass of water, spray on the colors which I want to use to activate the pigment. Here I am using one of the Art by Marlene watercolor brushes. Now, there is 2 ways you can do this. You can do it wet on dry technique as I am doing here, meaning I am putting a wet color on a dry paper, or wet on wet technique, which is really fun and it gives more loose results, and means when you previously wet your paper and then put your color on it. I couldn't choose which technique of those 2 I like better. It honestly just depends of my mood. Working with watercolors is also giving nice results when you heat emboss your images. I usually heat emboss it in black color, but do try to heat emboss your image with a clear embossing powder just for a really fun results. Anyway, as perhaps you can notice, I am trying to put more color, to layer more color towards the center of my flower and go with a lighter hand towards the edges. But also one thing that you might have noticed is that I don't color my petal towards the very edge, because that actually gives some natural highlights. Also very important to mention that they are watercolor based markers. There are many types on the market. I have these three and they can work just as fine like watercolors. You place the color on your paper and activate it using some water, and with this technique you might have a bit more control, so it's actually all about personal preference. The third coloring medium about which I would like to talk with you is acrylics. There are very many available brands on the market, but at the moment I will be working with Art by Marlene acrylics, and this time for demonstration purposes I will be using a watercolor brush with a water barrel. This particular one comes from Studio Light in a set of 3. But don't forget that Marlene also has 3 beautiful sets of brushes specifically for working with acrylics. Anyway, as you can see, I'm trying to dilute my acrylics because I feel it gives much better result than making it more chunky. And after drying the first layer, I can layer more color if I find it necessary, or even to add another shade. This time I was going for a more brighter result, so I wasn't bringing any more new shades. But here you will see how I will blend the multiple colors for achieving the shadows. I strongly advise that you try to work a bit faster with the acrylics than, let's say, with watercolors, because once they are dry they become permanent and can't be reactivated like watercolors. So that's just something to keep in your mind when working with them. Again, you have acrylic based markers. There is once again many brands on the market available. You just pick which type you like working, and they work again same like the acrylic itself. Just depends which format of acrylic is easier for you to work with. Now, one technique which is really fun for coloring if you don't care for precise results is coloring with inks. One of the inks which I usually go for are Ranger Distress Oxide Inks, and I use ink blending brushes. These particular ones are from Studio Light. Positive thing about this technique is that you get really fast results, but once again I will say you can't get precise coloring unless you decide to use these inks as watercolors. Not every type of ink can work this way. They have to be water reactive inks, like for example Distress Oxides. So if you want to use them as watercolors, you just smudge them on your glass mat and then use a watercolor brush and color it normally like you would do with watercolors. This technique I mostly use back at the start of my mixed media days, when I had more limited craft supplies, didn't have such a good choice of acrylics, watercolors, etc. Oh, and here I just had to spray some water because that's one technique I always have to do when I use Distress Oxides. Now I will show you a really mixed media type of technique and really fun technique for fast results. But for this technique to work, you have to make your surface non-porous. One way to do that is to cover your paper with matte medium. And very, very, very important, be sure that the matte medium is dry before you start coloring, so you don't ruin your markers. The markers which I am talking about are Faber-Castell PITT Artist markers. They are made out of India ink, which is permanent once dry, but on a non-porous surface it has some small dry time. just a couple of seconds, which is actually the time when you can still move this ink. So basically you color the surface with your marker and smudge it with your fingers. This is one of the techniques which I sometimes in my videos use for adding shadows or making the colors of my images more vibrant. But of course it can be used as a coloring technique as well. In the description box down below, I will leave the list of links for these products if you want to try them yourself. Now another easy beginner-friendly medium for coloring is pastel pencils. Mine are Cretacolor, but you have many brands on the market. As usual, I start with the darker shade and then bring in the brighter one and blend them in together. You can use a blending stump or your finger, just like I'm doing it here. This is also another technique which I sometimes use to make shadows for my art journal pages or to give a glow effect, because it's actually really simple to work with. But the thing you have to be aware, this is not permanent. So it can easily be transferred to your other pages or removed just by paging. So you have to use a fixative. There are multiple ones on the market. The one that I'm going to use is this one. I will of course spray my flower on the balcony and the image becomes light fast and permanent. The last technique for this video is coloring with alcohol markers. Now what you have to be aware that for this to work perfectly you need a marker pad, meaning a special type of paper which will prevent your markers from bleeding and make them blend easier. But also you need a special ink for stamping. I tend to use this one, Memento. Now also there are multiple types of alcohol markers on market. I have the Spectrum Noir 3 blend markers and some Copics. My Spectrum Noirs are with the bullet nib. And one good thing about them is that they have 3 shades in them included. Meaning it's really good for beginners because you don't have to think about which colors blend well, which colors match. They are already included in one pan. And once again, I am mixing always at least 3 shades for coloring this size of image. But of course you don't have to go with 3, I will here use actually more for more subtle results. In my opinion, the number of shade which you can use for coloring the image depends also on the surface on which you are working. If I am working with some really fine detailed images, there is not really space for blending all those shades, so I will use just 2 or 3 of them maximum. But if I have a large surface, like for example this image, this flower, then I might blend in more shades. It depends also on my moods and how precise results I want. Now for the sake of demonstration, the rest of the flower I will color with Copics. I started with 2 shades, but as you will see I realized I wanted more smooth transition, so I will bring another shade. But I think that's just sometimes me being perfectionist. 2 shades could have worked just fine as well. I know that coloring with alcohol markers seems really intimidating to some, and it was to me at the beginning, but it all just takes practice. And I guarantee you, in a bit of time, you will get better at it. Why I like coloring with alcohol markers is they are fully transparent, so they won't dull the outlines of your stamped images, and they give very vibrant results. Anyway, here I have shown you 7 ways to color your images. I really tried to give a lot of information, but please, if you have any questions, any at all, feel free just to write in the comment section and I will try to answer you within my knowledge. Thank you very much for watching and I hope to see you soon again. Bye!